Hi everyone, thank you very much for coming. Today we're going to start off with Professor Tim Parkin, who's published numerous papers on the epidemiology of racing and the outcomes and risk factors associated with that. So we're very pleased to have him here today. Please welcome him, and he's going to talk about the potential for use of data and risk mitigation in racing. Thank you very much.
So given we're starting 6 minutes early, no, I won't. I'll leave them to someone else. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invite to come and speak today. As suggested, I'm now at Bristol Vet School, and I've been head of school there since November 2020, started in the middle of the pandemic, kind of interesting time to start as a head of school. But I do have a great team beneath me who actually include astrophysicists and the like, who probably when I stole them from the astrophysics department in Glasgow, they probably didn't know how many legs a horse had, but they can code and they can manipulate data and produce the models that we use and we try to use to predict injury and fatality to better the welfare of the racehorse. So credit to them, really. So what I'm going to talk about today, a little bit of the recent history of racehorse epidemiology, talk about where we've probably had most recent greatest impact, a little bit about what we think is required really for them to be able to make the next big step forward. I'm going to talk somewhat about who I think the responsibility lies with, and then finally just talk a little bit about the risk of prediction. What I'm talking about is predicting risk, but I think there's also, if you switch that around, there is quite a lot of risk in making those predictions as well. So I've been at this game since I left Bristol in '98 and actually didn't go into clinical practice at all. I went to do a PhD in fractures in racehorses, so I've been at this game for sort of almost 25 years now. At least one of my supervisors in the audience. Thank you, Ellen. I've been very lucky to stay in this particular area of research and been able to work with multiple jurisdictions around the world. The beauty about racing is that data is plentiful. And actually, I talk to the racing jurisdictions, I ask them about their particular issues, their particular welfare concerns, and I present potential solutions that we could derive if we have their data, we have availability of their data, and we can actually model what they're trying to predict and actually trying to understand what increases the likelihood that individual horses will end up with their particular welfare concerns. So we've done a lot of that in many racing jurisdictions around the world. The key steps in that are essentially acquisition of the data, full recording of those data, analyses, and then communication of the results back to the stakeholder. And really what we're trying to do is to either influence or affect veterinary regulation or, in more subtle ways, increase the awareness of equine welfare and bring that higher up the agenda in everyone involved in racing or other equestrian sports in which we work. So just to give you an idea of the size of the scope of the data that we deal with, and these are the data from the North American equine injury database, the work that we've been working with them since 2009 when they introduced the equine injury database. We now have more than 4.5 million rows of data in essentially what you might imagine as a spreadsheet, but you can't visualize that, covering 300,000 individual horses. So it's a voluntary scheme in the States, but it covers pretty much 97% of all starts are covered by the equine injury database. That actually, in addition to that, we've now accumulated about 8.5 million training events. That's by nowhere near coverage of the whole lot. That's in particular states where we can do individual state modeling, such as California. Most of that includes signal data, race performance data, as you might imagine, some fast work training data, as we talked about. But from all of those individual bits of information, we now, by routine, create at least 300 new variables that we interrogate and we plug into the models to try and understand what are the factors that are influencing the likelihood that an individual animal, when it starts the race, is more likely to end up dead or more likely to end up with a fracture at the end of that race than the rest of the horses it's racing with. I'll come back to this again, but we still have, and you can imagine why, we still have very little veterinary treatment data associated with these data, and it is still a relatively small proportion of the training data. So we certainly don't know what every horse does on every day of its life in the North American data. And that, I'll talk to this in a minute, that does limit our predictive ability with respect to what we're aiming to do. Nevertheless, since we started working with the North American data back in 2009, The overall risk of fatal injury was approximately 2 per 1,000 starts. Now that's very high internationally. So we were starting from a high base, so you'd expect us to make progress, but over that time, we've now got it down to about 1.25 per 1,000 starts, so more than a 38% drop in the risk of fatal injury on US racetracks over that period. And that equates to, if there'd been the same number of starts occurring in 2022 as there were in 2009, that's more than 200 horses that aren't dying now that would have been dying in 2009 on the racetrack in itself. So that's not in training, but that's just on the racetrack. So I think that's a significant impact. How have we achieved that? A lot of attitudinal change. I go over and speak at the Welfare Safety Summit on a regular basis, talk to lots of trainers, lots of vets. And actually, I think what we've done is we just raised the awareness of equine welfare up the agenda much more than it was back in 2009. I'm not sure it was really addressed in a great deal at that point. And I think people are now just thinking about that much more regularly, making different decisions about their horses, whether that be based on models we produce, based on the risk factors we identify, or just actually their gut feeling. They're making different decisions, I think. There have been, I mean, I just focus on this actually. I think it's interesting that you'll see for the first 5 years, we were hardly touching anything at all. And that's because it took that long to actually derive sufficient data for us to be able to produce the first model. So I think this does give reasonable evidence that actually the models we produced, identifying the risk factors are important, then actually have had an impact from around 2013, 2014 onwards. I've said it's attitudinal change and bringing welfare higher up the agenda, but clearly you may be aware that there have been quite a lot of regulatory changes in the States that have been specifically evidence-based and aimed at reducing risk. And I think it's worth talking, just to highlight one of those that has clearly had an impact. If we talk about the void claim rule, so assuming that some of you don't know about the void claim rule, lots of claiming races in the States, more than 50% of starts are claiming races in the States. It's a significant issue that they are fully aware of. They are claiming races in and of themselves are significantly associated with a higher risk of fatal injury. There's no real there was no real deterrent for a trainer to try and move a horse on by putting him in the claiming race and getting rid of the problem. And we know that in lots of the models we produced, racing for a new trainer was a significant risk factor. And the longer a horse had been with the same trainer, then their risk incrementally decreased of ending up with a fatal injury. So trainers are picking up horses with very little understanding of their background, very little understanding of their veterinary histories, how they train, etc. And actually those horses are immediately at greater risk when they start racing for a new trainer. So about 5 years ago, there were a range of different void claim rules, or lots of tracks had no void claim rules. And essentially a void claim rule means that if you claimed a horse out of a race and it ends up lame or indeed dead, you can actually void that claim so you don't have to take on that horse. So there was a way of essentially saying if a horse ended up coming out of a race, not in the state that it went into the race, you could give it back to the original owner. So there was a concerted effort to introduce void claim rules at all tracks over this period. And if we look at how this has what has happened here, down at the bottom we got these two on this side here are claiming races, and these are maiden claiming races. The blue dot indicates prior to the introduction of a void claim rule at those particular tracks. The orange dot indicates the risk of fatal injury post the introduction of a void claim rule at those individual tracks. And you can see that this is a sort of a quite clear evidence that actually indicate that we use to then say, okay, there has to be national void claim rules introduced, and thankfully that has largely happened now. And we've seen a very significant reduction in the risk of fatal injury, and I'm sure that this is one of the regulatory interventions that has clearly precedented that and led to that position. So these are the type of data that the North Americans will routinely ask us to produce, and produce as a way of actually persuading those in the stakeholders, whether they be trainers, racetrack owners, or whoever, that actually this is a good thing to do. And actually they regularly now have these conversations based on the very significant large numbers of data that we have available to us. So a 24% reduction in claiming races in those tracks that introduced a void claim rule over that period. The other thing at the time was that actually, as I said, there were a whole range of different void claim rules. So left is no void claim rule. Type 1 is fatality plus vet list. So if a horse was put on the vet list post-race, so in other words, it came out and had to go on the vet list and actually then has to work to come off the vet list before it can race again, so some form of lameness, then that seemed to have the greatest impact. Type 2 is fatality only, then you've got fatality, vet list and bled, and fatality and van off. So a whole range of different void claim rules designed in different states. But all of them had the desired effect compared to not having a void claim rule on particular tracks anyway. So regardless of the type of void claim rule, they were all having a beneficial effect. So if we think about what's required to make the next big step, we've talked about, the first 20 years of my career 15 years, were about identifying risk factors and actually then talking about those risk factors and getting people to think about them. We're now much more aligned to actually identifying the at-risk horse and actually being able to prevent, being able to predict, and therefore prevent those fatal injuries occurring in the first place. The depth of the data is more than sufficient. I've already talked about the multi-millions of rows of data we have. We have statistical power to the minutiae. We're identifying risk factors that are very, very small, have minimal impact, and probably are relatively negligent, and we really don't need to worry about. We're not going to be identifying new risk factors based on more data, more rows of data. To give you an indication, 2.4 billion data points is what we deal with the US data, and that gets updated every year. They send us a routine new years of data every year. It's the scope of the data that we're lacking, as I already referred to. Veterinary histories and training data are the key aspects that we know are likely to be predictive in terms of the likelihood of a horse ending up with a fatal injury. But the important thing is, those veterinary histories and training data must be complete and comprehensive. They have to cover the whole cohort of individuals, or at least 90%. It can't be that we set up another prospective epidemiological study to look at prospective training data in 12 yards or whatever it may be. That's not going to cut it. It has to be across the whole piece. Now, getting hold of the veterinary and medical training and medical data, we clearly know that's fraught with difficulty, confidentiality issues, value of individual horses, etc. We recognise that's not an easy ask, but if we're genuinely trying to make the next big step, that's what is required. And I'll show you some evidence from work we've done in Hong Kong recently that points to that clearly indicates to us how important that is. Reviews of post-fatal injury will not get us to where we need to be. It's all well and good looking at reviews of injured horses or fatally injured horses and trying to understand what went wrong with that individual animal. But actually, that's not going to give us the bigger picture. That could just be a particular nuance of that individual animal or that group of animals. And that's what we're battling at the moment. I'm involved in some of the Churchill Downs stuff. And actually, of those 12 fatalities, trying to understand how they fit into the bigger picture, it's just not enough individual animals, not enough data points to really give us a proper indication of what's going on. Very, very difficult to do it on an individual horse basis. So how do we see this working? Well, we like to think that actually what we do with these data is it's all about communication. So once we run the models, we run the analysis. It's for the vet. We don't see it as a panacea at all on which black and white decisions should be made. This is just another aid to diagnosis. Can help clinical suspicion. Some of the stuff we're working with in Hong Kong suggesting that actually we might be able to better risk profile individual horses that are going for advanced imaging. So actually identify those horses that are most likely to benefit from advanced imaging rather than just take the trainer's word for it or the vet's word for it and actually just start doing some data risk profiling to understand which horses are most likely to benefit. But equally, when the regulatory vet is trying to make a decision about a horse, whether they should pass them or not, if they're unsure about the decision they're going to make, if the risk profile suggests that the horse is a high-risk horse, then maybe they'll make one decision. If the data-driven risk profile suggests they're a low-risk horse, maybe they'll make a different decision. And we're looking to implement that on a pilot basis in Hong Kong over the next 12 months, hopefully. But equally, this is about communication with trainers and owners, and actually just getting them to think about which race, which competition to enter the horse into, and indeed, is it maybe time to retire that horse before something catastrophic ends? So how do we propose to go about doing this? Well, the development phase is essentially what we do all the time with lots of different models. The key I want to talk about is the big red tick at the end, and this box is deliberately blank at the moment because we've never got to this stage right now. You develop these models, and you might, for example, use data from 2010 through to 2020 to develop the model, but then you must validate it before you put it in place. You have to test the model to give you some confidence that it's doing what you're hoping it would do. So the way we would, by routine, do that would then take the 2021 data and pretend we had the model in place at the beginning of 2021 and try and understand how accurate it would have been in terms of predicting whatever it is we're trying to predict. And then you can essentially regard it as a diagnostic tool to say, yes, it gets a positive predictive value of X or whatever. And it's only once we've done that repeatedly that we would ever consider letting any of these decision-making tools loose in any regulatory setting. And it's frustrating that we've been working with the US Jockey Club since 2009, but we both them and us, are not comfortable with the predictability of the models we produce to actually use them in a regulatory format. If we do get that big tick, and we're able to say that they are predictive enough, essentially then it's a very quick process. That modeling process can take more than 3 months, but it's a very quick process then to take the race entries, run them through an algorithm, and you essentially produce some sort of risk rating, such as this is just made up. So that can then come back within hours back to the regulatory vet, and that's an additional tool they can use to try and make a decision about individual horses on the track. So just a comment about why we're not more predictive, other than the fact we don't have training and veterinary data. Actually, thankfully, what we're trying to predict is still a very rare outcome. So approximately 0.1% of starts end in fatal injury, if you look across the globe. So if you had to guess, you're always going to say this horse is going to come home safe, and you're going to get it right 99.9% of the time. So we're trying to improve upon a model that's already very, very good. So our predictability has to be very high before we're actually going to try and implement any of this in racing. The other thing we can do, we can try and change the outcome we're looking at and actually look at an outcome that is more prevalent. So we're trying to avoid this very rare outcome phenomenon that makes it quite difficult to predict. And the reason we might do that is we've got a lot of evidence to say that previous injury is a precursor for fatal injury subsequently. So actually there's an opportunity to intervene further down the track, further away from the catastrophic event, to try and intervene in that individual animal's racing career, treatment, whatever it happens to be. So actually we're now looking at trying to predict those precursors to the fatal injury rather than actually the fatal injury itself. And that helps solve a little bit of the problem about dealing with a very, very rare event. Lots of people always ask me about AI. It's not going to be the panacea, without a doubt. I had a PhD student specifically focused on this, trying to compare AI tools with our conventional frequentist statistical models. The predictability of the different techniques, he used about 3 or 4 different AI techniques. It's not artificial insemination, I should say. Artificial intelligence we're talking about. Have to remember to say that in veterinary audiences. The predictability was very, very similar. So they don't produce something magic, black box magic, that actually can suddenly solve the world. This is not going to happen in this particular sphere. So I just want to talk about how predictability can be improved and just give you some indication of some of the advances we're now making. So this is work with the Hong Kong Jockey Club, funded by the Hong Kong Jockey Club Equine Welfare Research Foundation. And you may know in Hong Kong, extensive history related to veterinary medical records, pretty known, as I said, knowing what every horse does on every day of its life, presents an enormous opportunity. It does cross all horses, collected by routine, not as part of investigations, and therefore available to us to start running models that we hope that we've seen are much more predictive. So previously our max predictability was about 70% working with the routine data. We're now approaching 85% just by the addition of the veterinary and training histories in that Hong Kong data. And to give you an indication of what that means, if I had a race and I knew that 2 horses were going to end up were in that race, one was going to end up dead and one was not going to end up dead at the end of the race. With 70%, I'd get that correct 70% of the time. 85%, I get it correct 85% of the time. And you remember, if you toss a coin, you're going to get it right 50% of the time. So actually being 70% accurate is nowhere near good enough. And actually we need to get something north of 90% to be anywhere near thinking about implementing this in practice. So, but it is the first time we've been able to include veterinary data in those analyses, and actually it has had a bit of a step change, but we've still got room to improve, I believe. Some results that have come out of that, and I think are sort of pertinent to this audience, and this actually, some of the first work came from this from Argentina. We were doing some work in Argentina, and there are certain races in Argentina where declaration of bute is permitted. So those horses would have received bute at some point leading up to that particular race, and those races had a 50 to 70% greater risk of either musculoskeletal injury or fatal injury for horses racing those particular races. So that was our first indication of a relationship with bute, or the pathology associated with bute, I should say. And then subsequently, with the Hong Kong data, administration of a non-steroidal since the last race. This is interesting. Increases the likelihood, these are the 2 outcomes we've been working with in Hong Kong, post-race lameness or unacceptable performance. Produce an increased likelihood of post-race lameness if they've got a record of administration of a non-steroidal since the last race. but they have a reduced likelihood of a steward's decision about unacceptable performance. So essentially what we're doing in this situation is getting the horse to run to form, but at potentially detriment to its welfare. Now, I understand the pressures to have horses run to form and that sort of thing in the gambling public and that sort of thing, but it does raise an interesting issue about the tension between what we should be doing and shouldn't be doing and the value of each of those different decisions. And I was discussing this with Chris 3 months ago, something like that, and we talked about the fact that some trainers or vets would, by routine, use non-steroidals on the day of the race after the post-race, regardless of whether the horse had been diagnosed as lame or not. So we've teased this out a little bit more, and actually we have identified that those horses that receive a non-steroidal 1, 2, or 3 days post-race are actually significantly more likely to then end up lame, post-race lame in the next race, compared to those who by routine would almost always receive a non-steroidal on the day of a race, regardless of what the vet had said and that sort of thing. So that gives us indication that actually what we're identifying here is a true relationship between the pathology associated with the need to prescribe bute and then the subsequent risk of post-race lameness. And again, this just feeds into the risk profile. Again, when that regulatory vet is trying to make a decision about whether that horse should race in the next race, they've got this information available to them. They know by how much more the risk will go up if the horse has received non-steroidal since its last race. So where does the responsibility sit? So this is where I start talking about regulators and that sort of thing. I think it's really critical that, and when I start talking to new jurisdictions who maybe don't have the funding and the ability to run risk factor models and start doing predictive analytics and that sort of thing, but they, in my view, they have to know the state of play in their own sport. They have to have good data that tells them how many horses are dying, how many horses get injured and that sort of thing. They have to be transparent about risk. You have to genuinely put welfare at the top of the agenda. And I do a lot of work with the FEI as well, so I put both athletes here, so I'm talking about eventing and that sort of thing as well. Have to really engage in designing evidence-based actions and changes and actually then owning the risks. So actually designing the modifications based on those and actually then assessing the impact of those. It's really, really critical. Those are the steps that close the loop to decide whether actually what they've done has been beneficial at all. And we have to be more proactive. We can't just be reactive to events at Cheltenham or Aintree and that sort of thing. We have to be genuinely more proactive in everything we do. It has to be an ongoing effort to continually try and do these things so that when we get those trigger events, we can say that we've been doing X, Y, and Z continually. I put this picture in. This is L'Aquila in Italy, where they had the very significant earthquake, probably 15 odd years ago now it was. But the reason I put this in is that we're talking about the risk of prediction here. And there were 6 officials who were jailed for predicting that there wouldn't be a major event in the weeks leading up to this event where actually multiple people died. And that prediction of there not being a significant event, they're very likely, and actually their risk, they suggested 1 in 1,000, very close to the risk that we're trying to predict. So that's why this sort of chimes with me. 6 of those individuals were jailed. They were later freed, 6 to 12 months later. But they'd made this prediction, and that resulted in people in the area going back into their homes. And then there was a major event that came along just within 3 weeks. So prediction is risky, and this is why we have to think about the consequences of those predictions that we make. And these are some of the discussions we always have with the US Jockey Club in particular, and particularly litigious society, as you can imagine. The consequences of our predictions are not benign. We're talking about multi-millions of betting. Spectator confidence in the sport is really important. Implications of withdrawing the horse. You withdraw a horse for the Derby, and then it goes on to race 5 or 6 times subsequently without any issue. Well, it's missed its one big shot, so actually you have to be really careful about that. And then the implications of not withdrawing the horse clearly relates to welfare, jockey welfare as well. So we work through it's really important to think very, very carefully about all the potential consequences of predictions that are put in place or risk profiling that are put in place before anything is launched to anyone in the industry who might be making a decision, whether that be a rider, an athlete on top of an eventing horse, or someone at a training yard or anything like that. Actually, if you give them tools which they may use, even if they're not designed for prediction, if you give them the tools to use for decision making, then I think there is some responsibility on those who design the tools to actually caveat them and make sure that people understand there are significant limitations to some of these things. So I'm not, by no means am I saying this is a panacea. And as I said before, none of these decisions should be made unless the models are sufficiently validated and have been tested. It's really, really critical. So just some final comments, and I'm going to leave a little bit of time. What we're trying to do, we're aiming to prevent the outcomes we don't want to see, clearly, must be based on sound evidence. As I said, prediction is not benign, and poor prediction is definitely worse than no prediction. We run the risk, and potentially life-threatening risk, and some of you may have heard me talk about some of the things that are going on in eventing at the moment with respect to some of their predictive tools there that I'm not particularly a fan of. You would potentially result in individuals making a decision more in eventing about making a potentially life-threatening decision to go up a level if they're basing that on a tool that at the moment isn't fully validated. And it's really critical that we are aware of that, and we have individuals are going to make decisions based on some of the things we put into the public domain. So it's really important to think about that. Again, the onus is on the governing body, the regulator, to do the due diligence, understand that actually the science that's coming into this has to be peer-reviewed, has to go through proper scrutiny so that we all understand that actually we're working on the same hymn sheet. And again, test the model is really, really important. So just to summarize, there are a lot of tools available to us. We can run these models very, very quickly now. We have multiple different analytical techniques to do so. Progress can be made, but it's really important to understand that the complexity of what we try and do, and actually the difference, the number of different risk factors that we're talking about, it should not be underestimated. There are lots of risk factors that go into these that all contribute 1%, 0.5% of risk into these models. So it's not very easy just to take those all out in isolation. At the moment, no tools are predictive enough for regulation on our own. And just a reminder that prediction is risky. So we have to be very careful about how we use these tools altogether. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Mainly we'll do questions at the end, but I do think we're just getting some lectures put up. So if we could just do, if anyone has any questions, that would be great. We could go for some now. Anyone have any? Oh, go ahead.
You mentioned the figure of 1 in 1,000. Are there other equestrian activities or sports?
It's quite difficult. The risk is lower. Well, it depends what that's fatal injury, so that's fatality. So definitely compared to other sports, equestrian event sports, and that's at the high end. But as you can imagine, actually that's based on a comprehensive understanding of all the starts in the particular sport we're talking about, in racing. Actually trying to get the same data for other equestrian events is quite difficult. The systems aren't in place to collect all of the different starts data, if you like. So actually having the denominator is quite difficult in other sports. Okay. How are you?
Thank you very much.